Morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good? Yeah? Good. Excellent. So my name is Paul Harris. I'm the principal consultant at Coacto. We're a boutique Salesforce consultancy based in Cheltenham, but I work all over the UK for a variety of customers. And the purpose of my talk this morning is really just to talk about some hints and tips around Salesforce project success. So if you've read the little brief in the London School Guide, it's slightly different because as I was writing it, I realised I wanted to talk about something else than what I'd originally intended to. So apologies if you feel you've been misrepresented, but I think there'll be some valuable takeaways for you from the presentation this morning. So let's talk about the challenge. But before we talk about the challenge, nice, calm, relaxing picture just to set the scene. So for me, one of the great things about Salesforce is how easy it is to change. Things are really easy to change. You can just go in and make some changes really quickly. And users can come along and say, well, I'd really need this. Can you add this field? Can you do that? And as an admin, it's very easy to make those changes. How many admins do we have in the room, by the way? How many admins? How many people are users? Okay. Consultants? Okay. So I think, that's one of the great things about Salesforce. One of the challenges about Salesforce is that it's easy to change things. So we're in this dilemma all the time, that it's very easy to change things, and based on Julia's talk earlier on, we can go in and we can make those changes so quickly that we can forget to document them, we can forget to capture the requirements, we can forget the context around which that change is made in the org. And that ultimately leads to change that users don't get on with, and you find that you might roll out changes that somebody says, what's going on? I mean, I had a call this morning from a customer just on my way here saying, we made all those profile changes and now this user can't do this. And I said, well, did you test it in the sandbox like I told you to? And the guy said, no, I just rolled it straight out into production environment. So kind of, there you go. Those are the kind of challenges that you face. But Salesforce is great. I love Salesforce. It puts my food on the table, so I'm very grateful for that. But clearly there are some things we need to do to manage how we manage that environment. So let's move on to my first group of tips. So we're going to have about 7 or 8 groups of tips that I'm going to go through here. So the first one is really about getting everybody on the same page and everybody speaking the same language. I don't mean English, Mandarin, Chinese, Indian, or whatever. This is really about making sure that people understand what it is they're dealing with. And I've worked on many projects where the language that's used, the terms that have been used, have been a real challenge. And often they mean different things to different people. So a lead to one person may be a prospect to somebody else. I worked in one organisation where they had leads and prospects, and they wanted opportunities to be called prospects. And I've never come across that before. But I found that quite confusing as a consultant, that I'm dealing with something that's an opportunity that I think is actually a prospect, but it's actually an opportunity. So you find yourself getting quite confused. And so I think it's really important to consider how that becomes part of your project. I also think it's really important when you're looking at a business, and I go in and get thrown in at the deep end, as I'm sure some of the other consultants in the room do, in terms of understanding what the business is about, how it works, how it operates, what the processes are. But I think it's really important when you're implementing to use the terms that are used within that domain. So account is not a great term in Salesforce. Salesforce calls companies accounts. I personally think that's not a great term, and I often change it for many organisations because people are dealing with patients, customers, clients. Change the terminology to suit the use of the system, and make sure that that use is consistent right the way across the business, because the marketing department may use the word prospect, which means something different to the sales department. So it's really important to try to get that consistency because it gets everybody on the same page. So those are my recommendations for the do's. My recommendations for the don'ts around terminology are acronyms. How many people here use acronyms on a daily basis? I mean, our industry is full of them. We just use them as part of our natural speech. I personally hate acronyms. It's just one of my hobby horses. I'd put them into Room 101 if I had the opportunity. I think they just hide clarity. They hide understanding. Not everybody understands what an acronym is, and not everybody wants to put their hand up and say, excuse me, I don't understand what GDPR means. So get rid of them. I really strongly recommend get rid of them. The other challenge is really is Salesforce uses a lot of technical language. The apps use a lot of technical language. But when you're implementing a system for business users, the users don't understand that technical language, just like they don't understand the acronyms. So think very carefully about how you're discussing and working with users, working with stakeholders, working with the consultants. And again, make sure that you're all singing from the same hymn sheet or you're on the same page. It's really, really vitally important because that helps understanding. It helps your journey, it helps your direction of travel, it stops people tripping over themselves because they don't understand what it is you're talking about, or they look at something in the org and they think, I don't know what that means. And my final tip for a don't is don't assume understanding. We're all guilty of making assumptions. We have to make assumptions in our daily lives, but try not to make them. Question. If you're not sure about something, ask. If you need a deeper explanation or a deeper dive, ask the question. It always helps to ask the question because I think the key thing really for me and the key takeaway for this using the same terminology is if you use the same terminology, it helps understanding, it promotes engagement with what you're trying to do, and it drives adoption of the system because ultimately we're building these systems to be used to support a business or to support a business process. And so without that engagement and without that understanding, it makes it much, much more challenging. So tip number 2 is really about people, and it's about getting people doing the right things at the right time. Now often people are expected to be very flexible, particularly in this day and age, but I think it's really key to make sure that we have the right people doing the right things. Utilise people's strengths, get people involved in the process and doing the things that they know and love best. Don't get a developer trying to analyse requirements or writing user stories. They have to understand them, but they don't have to write them. So a couple of things from various projects that I've worked on. I worked on one project where the stakeholders came in and we set everything up and we got the project started, and then they disappeared. And they just completely disappeared and came back, towards the end of the project. Oh, how's it going, Paul? Is everything on track? It's like, where have you been for the last 3 months? Make sure that the stakeholders and everybody stays engaged as part of that process. It's vitally important. They're the ones that are sponsoring it, they're the ones that are financing it, they're the ones that are setting the direction of travel. They need to be engaged right across the process. Really important. Another project I worked on, which was extremely challenging, and going back to Julia's presentation, if any of you saw that earlier on, about sort of tidying up your org, I was brought into a project where 2 previous consultants had failed to deliver a system that worked for the business. They'd taken a very development-focused track, and this was a very user-level organisation. They had no technical people there, and people were leaving, the board was stressed, they were losing money. It was actually a wedding and events management company, and people's weddings were getting messed up, so you just can't imagine. How many people here are married? Can you just imagine having your big day messed up? It was unbelievable. I've never worked in such a stressful environment because the managing director said, look, this system's got to be in place by January, and I was speaking to him probably towards the end of November, and I'm thinking 4 weeks with Christmas in the way, that ain't going to happen. So what I had to do was compromise communication for delivery, and I learned the lesson that you should never ever do that. You need to keep people informed, give clients the big picture, keep everything on track, because unless everybody's engaged and communicated with, they lose track. So it sounds really simple, and a lot of these tips are really simple and really obvious, but I wanted to put them all in one place just to remind me of the things that we so easily forget. A lot of these are just, we should know them, but we don't always follow our best advice. And my third sort of tip for don't in the people category is don't allow laggards to derail the process or the progress of the project. You always get some doom and gloom people that come and say, oh, this is never going to work, I don't like this, I don't want to use this, I love my spreadsheets, don't make me use a system I don't want to do. Give people a voice, but don't let them derail the process, because the end game is what's important. The delivery and the system that's being built is really what counts ultimately. So let's move on to something a bit more positive now for the do's for people. Again, this is obvious. Get a project manager. How many people have ever worked on projects where there wasn't a project manager? Yeah. How were those projects? Were they, yeah. So I know project managers get a lot of bad press, but actually I think they're absolutely crucial to helping projects get successful and to achieve their end game. Really, really important, because they help manage the people. And I think it's really important that a project manager manages the people as well as managing the project, getting the right people in at the right time. And most importantly, making sure that the people that we get in are aligned with what they're good at doing. Get the people doing what they're good at. And a tip I learned from a system that I put together for a training company was map the people. Understand who you're dealing with. Understand what they're good at. Understand what they're not good at. And then get them in the right places at the right time. This actually comes from a sales technique called Huthwaite spin methodology. They build a people map so they understand who they're dealing with in order to make their sales. But I thought that was a really good technique for Salesforce projects and project management. Understand who's involved and what they can do. And I think, to summarize on the people track, I think it's really important just to give everybody a voice. Even, I know this may sound odd, even if you don't listen and act on what they say, give them the opportunity to say what they need to say to be part of the project. And I think from another project that I worked on, where the CEO was just, we're going to do this, I've got this great idea, I've got this great vision, he conveyed that to me, but he didn't convey that to the people who are going to be using the system. So not everybody understands why a new system's going in place, why they have to give up their spreadsheets, why they have to give up that known and loved system. So make sure that everybody understands why and make sure that everybody has a voice. Okay, so process. Anybody here mapped business processes? Everybody, yeah? I mean, I think that's really key. And one of the things I've learned is, a description of a process or a process document isn't always how the process is actually executed in practice. And I'm sure we've come across that in the past. So for me, again, some obvious things: understand and document the process. I worked on one project where the client said to me, well, we know what we need, here's a list of what we need, go away and do it, and come back and tell me when you're done, and then we'll have a look at it. And I said, well, I need to understand your business, and I need to understand your process. It's, we haven't got time for that, just get on with it, will you, Paul? And I said, well, I can't. I need to understand your process, so can we spend some time doing that? And eventually I convinced them, and now they map all of their processes, because for them they understand that visualization is important, because a process helps with the implementation, but it also helps with the operational use of the system. When they have new people coming in, they can say, this is our process, this is how we do it, and this is how the system supports that process. So again, really, really important. Anybody here use swim lanes? Yes, yeah. I really like swim lanes. I think they're really good. Not so much for the little, I know I've got a little flow chart up on the right hand side there, but really because I think it's important to understand the handover between processes. So when you're handing over from one person to another, one role to another, so sales hands over to sales operations, you have a handover, you have a junction there where some things need to happen. Some information needs to flow between the salesperson and the sales operations person, and some things need to happen in the system. So I think it's really important to capture those interfaces, because that is where things usually fail, in my experience. So again, really important, map them out, try and use swim lanes. But most importantly, actually, my top tip for process do's is validate and walk through the process. Get people in a room, maybe give them pieces of paper with each of the processes on, and walk it through. Is this what you do? When you process expenses, do you do it this way? Do you capture this? Where do the receipts go? Do you check the totals? Just validate everything, because as I said right at the beginning, the description of how it's done isn't how it's always executed in practice. And that again is where, as a consultant, I find gaps in systems that we build, is because I've been told one thing, but people actually do something else. So that again makes it quite challenging. Has anybody here ever done sort of the cup of tea process? Has anybody done that? Interesting. Yeah, you've done that. How did you find it?
We did actually, like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Okay, right. So,
like there's so many assumptions that you make that you don't realize that you're making.
Yeah, indeed. So it's a simple exercise. If you've not done something like that, making a cup of tea, making a coffee, making a sandwich, just write down what you think are all the steps involved in making it. And I guarantee you will miss so many things because of the assumptions you're making. So for the cup of tea, for example, you might forget to take the kettle off the side. You might forget to turn the tap on. oh, hang on a minute, I haven't lifted the lid on the kettle. So there's all those kinds of things that you need to think about. And that's the complexity that we deal with when we're building systems to support business processes. So you make those assumptions. It's absolutely classic. Do try it. Do try writing down how you make a coffee or something like that. But I think for a process, it's really the starting point of the understanding of what it is you need to do. For me, it's the entry point. I can't start without getting a process documented. So what about the don'ts on process? Well, I mean, I guess some of them are probably pretty obvious. Don't ignore it. I think, use the process that's in place at the moment to inform how the process should be in the future. Definitely don't ignore it. But don't base the understanding on some documents that somebody pulls out of a filing cabinet and says, oh, I've got we did the process. We mapped the process 3 or 4 years ago. Here it is. Well, of course, the people have changed. The business has changed. The business has moved on. And so those process documents, whilst they may have some value in just giving you a snapshot of where they're out of date. So don't drive your implementation based on old process documents. So my summary of that is you can't improve what you don't understand or you don't know. And so get it down, understand it, build that knowledge. So the next group is data. Well, systems are all about data, and we're hearing statistics about the explosion of data and how much data is now being created. And was it something that 80% of the world's data has been created in the last 12 months, or something ridiculous? I don't know what the statistic is, but it's a ridiculous statistic when you hear about it. And apologies for the pun in the subtitle there. I couldn't resist it. So don'ts around data migration. There are lots of them. This is just kind of a summary. Often people leave data migration right to the end of a project. Oh yeah, we'll deal with data migration at the end of a project. And I know some people are saying, really? Believe me, I've worked on one particular implementation where we were migrating from an old CRM system, and the customer wouldn't let us near the old CRM system. And they said, oh, the data's really straightforward. It's just accounts and contacts. We'll bring it forward. Yeah, okay, right, fine. Placed too much trust in that statement, because when we came to look at the data, boy, was it a mess. I mean, it was completely denormalized. And it took 3 weeks just to map the data, to understand it, so that we could then start to migrate it into the system. I mean, it was staggeringly I know you're thinking, how can accounts and contacts be so staggeringly complicated? Trust me, they were. Another challenge people face is taking every piece of data with you when you move to a new system. When you go on holiday, you don't take a suitcase of all your wardrobe, do you? You don't chuck it all in and take it away with you. And again, it's not necessary to take all the historical data with you, but some organizations have a real sense of, it's my data, it's important, I need it. So I would say, what do you need it for? How often have you referred to your historical data? Do you still report on it? Are there any KPIs running against it? And often the answers to most of those questions is no. So I say, leave it behind. If you need to keep your on-premise server in there running that system just so you can go back to it, fine, do that. But don't take it all, because basically, if you've got a large amount of unstructured data going into a system, A, it's going to be a big job to migrate it. But secondly, you're just going to be cluttering a system full of rubbish potentially. So just really think about that historical data. And make sure that everybody's involved. We all love spreadsheets. I like spreadsheets. I know that, I use, everybody here still use spreadsheets? They're still part of our daily lives, aren't they? Even though we know we should be using systems to capture and manage that data. But don't ignore them. Try to eliminate them, but don't ignore them. And reports and dashboards are so intrinsically linked to data. Again, they're really important. Think about those. One project that I worked on with an organization, the key stakeholder came to me with their reports and dashboards. That was the first thing I saw about their business. They said, look, these are the things I want to measure. These are the things I want to report on. And so I want you to build a system that delivers that. Now, that was really quite enlightening. I've never had an engagement with a customer like that, where they've come to me with all their KPIs and all of their dashboards already drawn out, saying, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. But actually, that was really quite enlightening, because I could then work back and say, okay, the system needs to capture the data to deliver this as an outcome, as well as supporting the process. So let's have a quick look at some do's around data. So definitely consider how you're going to migrate your data, taking into account the don'ts over on the right-hand side there. Look at specialist migration tools. In that example that I spoke about earlier, where it took 3 weeks just to map the data, we used a tool called Talend to build up the data map and all the relationships. We couldn't have done it without Talend. That was a great tool. It worked really well for us. Also consider cleansing your data before migrating it. And again, I often get told, oh, we haven't got time to cleanse it. It's too expensive. It's going to take too long. It's like, don't do that, Spring clean before you move the stuff across. And again, it's a fairly obvious statement, but it is important. But also model your data structure. Understand what your data is. And then that might be part of your migration strategy. It might be part of using a migration tool. But really understand what your data is. Because, the key thing about data is it brings a system alive. So for me, it's really important to use the right kind of data when you're doing testing or when you're working in a sandbox. And the most important thing is if people don't trust the data, they're not going to trust the system. Vitally important. If they think the data's wrong, they'll blame the system and then they'll stop using it. Okay, let's have a quick look now about some tools. And I often get clients say, "What do you mean I've got to use a tool? What do you mean you want me to use Trello or Jira or these kind of things? What's that going to give to me?" So I think it's important to use the appropriate tools for the job. So I've used Jira and Trello and Asana and a variety of other tools for customer engagements. Not all customers engage with them very well because they're unfamiliar. They don't know what they're supposed to do with them. But use tools that add value. So one customer, I did use a spreadsheet, or actually, I tell a lie. Several customers, I've used a spreadsheet. I said, well, just map the requirements out in a spreadsheet, you have a little status and so on. That's fine, it doesn't matter, but just capture that common understanding, even if it's in a spreadsheet. And make sure that people understand how they're going to be used and what they're expected to do with those tools. But also, for me, one of the most important things about documenting all of this is document what you're not going to do. How many people here document what they're not going to do on a project? Yeah, and it's really important. There's a tool called Moscow. Anybody come across Moscow? Must, should, could, and won't. I think it's important to document what you're not going to do as much as it is what you are going to deliver in a project. So if somebody comes along and says, oh, we really need that, you've missed it. No, hang on a minute, we said we weren't going to do that. Even if you're putting it onto the backlog and you're just flagging it and saying, I'm not going to do that, I think that's really, really important. Because not everybody understands Agile. I've met many customers that look at me and I don't do it now, but I don't use the word sprints and backlog and all that kind of stuff because people just glaze over. They don't know what it means. So make it applicable to them. So don't in terms of tools. Again, so some fairly straightforward things here. Don't let people push back. If you think you need to have a tool to capture the information, insist on it, but make sure it's the right tool, as I've said over here. And don't overcomplicate what needs to be done. Really try to keep it simple and manage your scope. Every project has had changes. Every project I've ever worked on has had changes. But don't ignore it. Don't say, oh, we'll deal with that at the end. Oh, we'll just make this change and then we'll deal with that at the end. Just make sure you stay on track with that change and use the tools to manage that change. Really try to keep it as simple as you possibly can, which is a hint for my very last tip, which we'll come on to in a moment. But I think the important thing for tools, as with CRM, is they achieve collaboration. They help understanding and they provide some documentation, which is really vitally important in any kind of system. So the system, yes, of course, you can have it yesterday. Everybody asks for the world and they want it yesterday. Some things around here. Don't design the new system model on the old system. I'm working with a client at the moment who wants their old system to look exactly like their new system. So we're having some challenges there. People don't like change, but don't fear change and innovation. And really be flexible in terms of what you think you want and evolve it in terms of as your understanding increases across a project, that's going to change. So expect to evolve your thinking. Expect the requirements to change. Expect the implementation and the way that the implementation is going to evolve to change. Don't be fixed on your thinking. Oops, wrong key. Sorry about that. That wasn't the end of the presentation. So some do's around systems. Think strategically, but act tactically. Build the big picture, but then implement pieces of that. And make sure that you document the stakeholders' vision and scope, what they want to achieve, so that you can set some outcomes and you can measure against those outcomes. And follow a process. Gather your requirements and write user stories and design a scalable architecture. So I'm just going to quickly whiz into the next slide. There we go. Change and adoption, really important. There are some tips there about anticipating and managing change. Don't skimp on training. Don't forget people don't like change. And don't allow people not to use a system. Make people use a system. It's really important because you've built this thing. Don't allow them to go back to their spreadsheets. Finally, don't try and boil the ocean. Don't try and bite off more than you can chew. Every project I've ever worked on has said, yeah, we want all of this, and we want it now, and we want more tomorrow. Try to manage your scope. And then these are the takeaways for your next project. Just consider some of these things. So if you just take away 1 or 2 tips from what I've described this morning, hopefully that will help you in your projects as you go forward. Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Good. Excellent. Enjoy the rest of your day.